Coming to you from 4,200 feet in the hills of Oregon, it's the voice of Chi-Town, the reddest beard in the high desert, your host of the MOA broadcast, Sam Wilson. All right, folks, as usual, we've got a fantastic show lined up for you today. This one is going to be even more fun, in my opinion. One of my favorite loves, one of my favorite things in life is the Old West. Now, I'm going to be honest, it's not some place I would want to live because of everything I've read and what we know about the Old West. It was a very hard and frequently short life. But it is amazing to me to read about the things these folks did and went through and the grit and the endurance and the indomitable will and power of the human spirit. And that is what we're going to focus on today in the form of a Wild West cattle drive. Episode 44 of the Make It Out Alive broadcast. Show highlights eating and drinking on a cattle drive, the coffee that changed the West, the logistics of a cattle drive, and to finish it off, a real cowboy adventure story. All right. So let me just throw out a quick disclaimer here up front, just like I do whenever I do my my true crime episodes. Guys, whenever you go back and research stuff, even as recently as like 30 or 40 or even 20 or 30, 40 years ago, it's very, very difficult to get all the research to say the same thing. Meaning that, you know, I may come up with research that says one thing, you may have research that says another, and who's to say both may be right and or wrong at the same time. So I did a ton of research for this episode, but I also did a lot of research along the way. Some of it kind of conflicted. So what we're going to do is in a situation like this, we're going to stick with the narrative. We did some excellent research, got a lot of good info, but I'm not going to sit here and keep saying, oh, well, this source said this and this didn't say that or whatever else. We're going to run with what we've got and try and stick with that. So a lot of good information. Stick around, and I think you will enjoy it. And again, just look at it. This is one possible set of facts or circumstances after much research. So if you hear something you don't like or that contradicts something you've read, don't flip out. I'm not saying this is the absolute end-all, be-all truth of it all. What we're saying is this is what our research showed, and at the very least, it is highly likely that most, if not all of this stuff, was true or somewhat true. Okay, that being said, let's jump into it. There's an old saying, you can tell a lot about a man by how he takes his coffee. Now, that's something I've talked about many, many times on the MOA broadcast, is my love of coffee. And that's going to be the subject of a lot of our conversation today. Cowboys didn't just drink coffee, they lived on it. When they were out on the trail, and we're talking specifically about a cattle drive. So for those of you that may not be familiar with the Wild West or the American West history, a cattle drive would be when someone had a cattle ranch, say in Texas, and they had to get those cattle before the proliferation of railroads and highways and tractor trailers and all that kind of stuff. They had to get those cattle from Texas to a cattle yard, stockyard in maybe Abilene, Kansas, or Chicago, or where in the world they went to so that they could be sold, and then the butchering would take place, or they'd be resold to someone else or whatever. So the way they did this was a cattle drive. Meaning they got them out on the road, out on the trail, and they drove them for sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles. But we'll get to that later. Cowboys had to have coffee on the trail. It was their lifeline. Something to wake up with, something to ride with, and something that reminded them of home. And briefly, let me add in that some of this is going to be done in my usual style of speaking extensively on an extemporaneous level. And some of this I have prepared in a somewhat manuscript style so I don't miss some of the more salient or interesting points. So, just in case you were wondering, folks, now the real question is, why did coffee matter? Coffee was a constant on the trail. Cattle drives could sometimes last for months. You're looking at 10, 12, maybe 15 men, one cook, and a lot of long, cold, lonely nights. Coffee helped to fight exhaustion and monotony. For many, it was the only warm comfort they had. A little piece of civilization in a wild land. Now remember, they're out there in the middle of nowhere. There's no Starbucks. There's no convenience stores. There's no 7-Elevens. They only had what they were able to bring with them, and they didn't have the safety and comfort and conveniences that we have today. Now, imagine, especially if you're in a cold time of year, I would imagine they took those things into consideration before starting a cattle drive, but things are unpredictable, especially when it comes to things like weather. So coffee was a huge, huge comfort. Not only that, it was extremely important when you're living on little sleep for weeks or months at a time, the toll that takes on your body. You need something to help get you up in the morning and keep you going during the day, and coffee is the perfect antidote to that, especially when brewed up nice and strong. Now, interesting notes here. Keeping coffee fresh. How did they keep coffee fresh for weeks or months on the trail at the time? You may or may not know this, that pre-roasted beans went stale fast in heat and dust like you would experience on a cattle drive. So most cowboys or cattle drives would carry green unroasted beans. The green coffee beans would last for months when they were stored in burlap or sealed in tins on the chuck-wagon. They would simply roast them as they needed them on the trail, fresh and right over the fire. Now, if you ever roasted coffee, it's actually pretty simple. It takes anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, depending on how deeply and dark you want the coffee roasted. So it's not the most involved process, but it was one more step that had to be done whenever you wanted to have that fresh coffee. Now, I don't know exactly if they would do 1 day, 2 days, a week worth of coffee bean roasting at a time. I didn't really look into that part of it. Regardless, this was something that had to be done on a regular basis to these green coffee beans. They had to be roasted prior to being grinded and prepared. Now, how was it roasted? Very simple. A skillet or a cast iron pan over an open flame or coals, depending on your source of research, had to be constantly shaken to prevent burning, and the beans would slowly go from the greenish or pale green color to a dark brown. They didn't have some sort of color meter or roasting chart to let them know. This was done by smell and sound and eye, not by a timer. The aroma of the roasting beans would tantalizingly draw every cowboy in camp closer to the fire. Then, now you've got your beans roasted, what happens next? Grinding on the trail. They didn't have an electric grinder, folks, or a burr grinder, or a conical grinder, or one of these fancy devices we have today. No electricity at all, so they carried small hand crank grinders. If they didn't have a hand crank grinder, or if something happened to it, then guess what? The beans were put inside a cloth sack, and they were crushed using the butt of a revolver, a knife handle, a rock, a stick, or who knows what else, whatever the opportunity they had or the means provided or afforded them on the trail. You got to realize these guys were the kings of improvisation for their time, because you have very little real estate to just carry luxuries on a wagon train, a cattle drive here. So everything has to serve a purpose, and everything has to be useful and functional. So you're not going to sit here and bring 3 or 4 different devices to properly grind your coffee beans. You're going to use whatever you got. And if someone forgot the grinder, or if someone dropped it or broke it and couldn't repair it, then guess what? You're going to smash them with the butt of your gun. You're going to smash them with your knife blade, whatever it is you got, a rock, a stick, as mentioned. Now, this gave you a rough, uneven grind frequently, but guess what? It didn't matter, folks. They were chasing flavor and strength, not some sort of aesthetic standard like we have today. If you've been in some of the coffee bars in places like Portland or other places around the country, things can get hoity-toity really quickly. This was the exact opposite of the Cowboys. Form had to follow function then. Function was supreme and ruled as king. So it had to give them that jolt to get them going above all else. Now, what about the cowboy coffee brew method? We've discussed this previously on the show, in fact, a number of different times, because I'm a big fan of cowboy coffee. So I'm going to go ahead and shut up. I may interject a few different points here, but I'll give you the research that I found. And again, some of this has been mentioned before. So you're looking at a big pot or a tin kettle filled with water. The grounds are tossed straight in. There's no filtering. There's no measuring. I'm sure if you've got a good cookie, he has some way of measuring this or keeping it consistent, whether it's a certain scoop that he uses consistently or whatever else. But, they're going straight in there. It's not like they have little filters to fill, the paper filters like in a traditional coffee maker or anything like that. It goes straight into the water. Then it goes, the pot itself will get set directly into the coals and boiled until strong enough, as one source put it, to float a horseshoe. Now, some cooks will let it boil for a while. Others would go until and simmer it until it just smelled right. This is all, there's a great range of personal expression here based on past experience, skill, ability, and preference. But there was no timer, and precision, while a part of it, was nothing like whenever you're doing it today with timers and with grams and scales and so forth. This boiled down to pure experience. And let me tell you, if you're going to err or as some would say, you better do it on the side of caution, of strength of coffee, not being worried about burning it or making some mud, because the last thing you want is a bunch of cowboys that haven't been around civilization or alcohol possibly and or women for weeks or months at a time and give them some weak coffee. Things are going to go badly for you. Now, when it comes to settling the grounds, we discussed again a number of times this particular aspect of it, settling the grounds in the pot. Whenever I make cowboy coffee, I don't do anything. If you let it sit for about 2 to 4, maybe 5 minutes after it reaches that boiling point or just shy of boiling, the grounds will settle, and then all you got to do is keep it right next to it or surrounded by, not on, the coals to keep it warm during your dining or drinking experience. But some folks, these grounds will settle, and if you pour it carefully and slowly, they're not going to be a problem. You're going to get a little bit in there. No, there's no way around that because it didn't go through a paper filter or mesh or something like that, but not enough to be an issue for most people. That being said, some folks have their own methods, and we're going to discuss some of these now. There are several tricks of the cowboy coffee trade that can be employed. Some folks will add a splash of cold water after the boiling hits. This helps the grounds to sink. I have never found this necessary, but again, these are different ways. Some folks will swear by these, and I would not contradict them. Do what works for you. Crushed eggshells. The calcium in the shells is supposed to help the grounds settle a little bit, as well as to alter the flavor a little bit, allegedly take out some of the bitterness or so forth. A pinch of salt added to the coffee can also help to cut the bitterness. Again, you're going to have to do this by experience, and we're just telling you some of the research that we found. In my experience, I have never done, or I haven't consistently done any of those things. I just brew it straight, let it settle, and then pour gently, and I have a great experience. Again, you do what works for you. And of course, the ultimate thing is after it settles, you want to pour it slowly, or you're going to be drinking with a bunch of grit in your mouth if you slosh it up. The coffee, of course, under circumstances like these, was often strong and smoky, sometimes bitter, definitely not for the faint of heart, and frequently described as liquid backbone. According to some sources, the old saying was you could stand a spoon in it. But folks, again, the importance of this coffee cannot be understated. This wasn't to sit at some cafe and stare out and think about poetry or about how horrible first world life in America is, such as you might encounter in a cafe or a Starbucks or a coffee shop in Portland or LA or New York or whatever. This was to get you going, to get out there and round up some cattle working 12, 14-hour days and dealing with the harsh realities of being in the Wild West, where you frequently didn't live past 30 or 40. So it was function, not finesse. As you can imagine, a good pot of coffee would be the center of camp life. In the morning, when the fire is crackling and the men are getting ready to get going and get out there and rock and roll for the day, they're going to sit around that pot and be smelling and drinking that hot coffee to get them motivated to go do something they don't want to do. In the evenings, coffee again, so they stay awake for night watch, or to help them unwind around the fire before they go to sleep and get up and do it all over again tomorrow. So coffee meant warmth, conversation, and community out on the trail. These were small outfits usually, something like 5 to 10, maybe 15 or max 20 men in most cases. So you would be around these men a lot, and that community and that rapport that would develop around a good pot of coffee would be very important. So remember, folks, cowboy coffee at the time wasn't about being gourmet, it was survival. It represented endurance and the ability to keep pushing on through unpleasant circumstances. It kept these men moving through dust storms, lightning, sleepless nights, attacks by men and wild beast, and just fatigue. Every sip tied them to something familiar, something human and home. Out there, that old black pot of coffee was more than a drink. It was a symbol of endurance. Now, that being said, that brings us to our next development. You may or may not. I mentioned earlier about the fact that a lot of times these coffee beans were brought out green and unroasted, and they were roasted and processed out on the trail. You may or may not have ever heard of Arbuckle's coffee. We're going to go briefly into the history of Arbuckle's, and what a massive impact this made on not just the wagon train and the cattle drives, but the world in general. So Arbuckle's coffee was known as, the slogan they had was the coffee that won the West. They were a trailblazer in the pre-roasted beans in the coffee market. So let me read this brief segment for you, and we'll kind of dice it up afterwards. Before Arbuckle's, coffee in the U.S. was mostly sold as green, unroasted beans. Consumers or camp cooks roasted it themselves before brewing in preparation. The problem with this being that green coffee beans required home roasting or trail roasting. Inconsistency and spoilage were big issues. A single burnt bean could ruin the batch or negatively impact an entire batch of coffee, and you may not have enough out on the trail to do another batch or to simply discard them. The innovators were the brothers John and Charles Arbuckle, originally out of Pittsburgh, but later moved to Brooklyn, New York, and entered the business in the mid-1860s and focused on coffee roasting and packaging. And did they ever revolutionize the coffee world? Some of their key innovations by Arbuckle's Coffee was, after purchasing and developing a roasting machine, they started marketing coffee already roasted and ground or ready to grind. They patented, now this is important, this is the key part that made this all work. They patented a glazing or a coating process which consisted of egg, sugar, gelatin, isinglass mix for roasted beans, which helped to seal in flavor and protect it from moisture and air and improve the shelf life. We'll dig into that a little bit here just again in a second. The Arbuckles didn't just roast coffee. They engineered a way to keep it fresh in an age before vacuum sealing. Their breakthrough was a special glazing process that was developed in the late 1860s. Once the beans came out of the roaster, they were coated with this thin, revolutionary mixture of egg white, sugar, and a bit of isinglass. Now, what is isinglass? It is a natural gelatin or collagen made from fish. That glaze locked in the coffee's natural oils, sealed out moisture, and stopped oxygen from dulling the flavor of the roasted coffee beans. The beans were then cooled, weighed, and packed into airtight 1-pound paper bags, a revolutionary step at the time. Before that, coffee was sold green in bulk and roasted at home or on the trail, which meant freshness could have been hit or miss. The Arbuckle's method gave cowboys and settlers a roasted coffee that could ride 1,000 miles on a wagon and still taste like it came out of the pan that morning. And that, in the late 1860s, was nothing short of magic. Now, interesting little tidbit here. It was rumored, I did a lot of research on this and found some conflicting reports, but at some point there was definitely a candy or a peppermint candy stick was included in many bags of Arbuckle's coffee. And legend has it, true or not, again, you may find different things in your research and results, but legend has it that when it came time to bust open a fresh bag of Arbuckle's coffee, old Cookie would holler out to the camp and let the boys know it was time to grind up a pound of coffee. And whoever volunteered to hand grind that package of coffee got the peppermint candy stick that was included in the packaging. Certainly a delicious and desirable sweet treat on the trail. Now, let me have a quick sip, and we're going to get into the logistics of a cattle drive in the 1800s, and then eventually the food and cooking. So, the logistics of a cattle drive. What do we have here? Moving on, the undertaking of a cattle drive on the trail back then was a massive undertaking, very difficult to even imagine without a bunch of backstory and or having been present for it. So either way, this was a tremendous undertaking and not to be taken lightly. What did it entail, and what were some of the parameters of a typical cattle drive in the Old West? Well, let's see. The length and duration of a typical cattle drive could have covered between 800 to 1,200 miles, depending on where they started and ended. Now, obviously, if you lived right outside of a cattle town, this wasn't a big deal, or a stockyard town, this wasn't a big deal. But many drives would start in South Texas in the Rio Grande region and go all the way to Abilene, Kansas, or other railheads on the Chisholm Trail that were roughly 900 to 1,000 miles away. Drives that started further south or west could stretch up to 1,500 miles or more, moving all these cattle. The journey typically took 2 to 3 months, sometimes up to 4, if weather or river crossings or stampedes would slow their progress. A good rule of thumb was about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending again on grass, water, terrain, and the temperament of the herd. The crews would often rest the herd 1 day a week if conditions allowed. So 6 days a week, that is a hard life. The crew size and structure, a typical cattle drive would have about 10 to 15 men, sometimes fewer on smaller outfits and up to 20 or more on very large drives. And again, as mentioned earlier, there are going to be a lot of variables. What we're doing is kind of the mean, the average of a lot of information and statistical data that we're taking from that time. So that's a good rule of thumb. 10 to 15 men, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. You'd have your trail boss, who was the absolute top dog and decision maker. A cook or cookie would be second in command oftentimes. He managed the food, the chuck-wagon, and morale. His coffee and biscuits and other food, along with his dentistry, his doctoring, and his refereeing of cowboy fights would be extremely important in making sure all these men who got sick and tired of the food, the dust, and the sleepless nights along with each other made it safely along with the cattle to their destination. You have a wrangler, which was often one of the younger hands who took care of the remuda, which is the herd of spare horses that each cowboy needed, which are several fresh remounts, basically. Cowhands and drovers would be typically 8 to 12 of these men. They would ride the herd day and night, manage the strays and keep the cattle moving, and take turns on night watch. And then your bottom hand would be the drag riders. These are the lowest ranked hands, often newer or less experienced, who rode at the back of the herd, eating trail dust all day. Most definitely a hard and dirty job. Each cowboy might be responsible for up to 250 to 300 head of cattle, though again that would vary by the size of the herd and terrain. A typical herd might number between 2,000 and 3,000 head of cattle, although again, obviously smaller ranches might move only a few hundred, just like the distances and the size of your team would matter or change or vary. Large drives, especially during the boom years of the 1870s to the 1880s, could include up to 10,000 head of cattle split into several herds, each with its own crew and chuck-wagon on the way to the same destination. You could typically spend up to 2 to 3 months or sometimes even 4 making this drive, whether it was anywhere from, again, 800, 1,200, 1,500 miles. Daily travel, again, your rule of thumb, 10 to 15 miles. So you can do the math for yourself on that one. Now, when we go into the logistics of what it takes to feed, because, the old saying goes, an army marches on its stomach. And to feed and keep these men hydrated was no small feat in itself. A full-size cattle drive, 10 to 15 men for 2 to 3 up to 4 months, would carry roughly 2,000 to 2,500 pounds of food in the chuck-wagon when they started off. So that's a ton or more of food to keep these guys fed and working out there. To break that down a little bit, flour, approximately, and again, guys, your research may yield different results. This was one path or one set of circumstances we looked up. So I don't want to hear, oh, that's not what I read. Do your own research. No problem. I'm happy to revisit this another time. Flour, 400 to 500 pounds. These will be used for biscuits, sourdough, gravy, all kinds of things. Bacon or salt pork, 300 to 400 pounds. This is going to give you your meat supply, and obviously these are cured heavily in salt for preservation. Beans, 200 to 300 pounds. Coffee, 100 to 125 pounds. That seemed kind of light to me, but hey, I drink a lot of coffee. Sugar, up to 100 pounds. Dried fruit, 50 to 100 pounds or more. Interestingly enough, in a lot of the research I did, I found that there was a lot of fruit or dried fruit that was taken along on some of these. Some research I dug into didn't mention it at all, or said that it didn't take place as much. But a lot of research kept coming up with there was a lot of dried fruit and such taken on these cattle drives. So interesting little side note. Salt and baking powder, 50 pounds. Obviously, you're going to need that for food preparation, preservation, and seasoning. And then lard or grease, 25 to 50 pounds for frying, cooking, etc. So about a ton of provisions is what it would take when they started out on the trail. Now, what about resupply if you start running low, or if some of your stuff spoils, or it gets robbed in the night, or a barrel drops off and gets burst open? They occasionally, from the research I did, they would occasionally replenish, but not always, or sometimes not even often. There were few reliable stores between Texas and Kansas railheads in the 1870s and 1880s, according to a lot of my research. What would be the typical practice, though? Resupply points would be settlements, army forts, or trading posts. How often? oftentimes only once, maybe twice on the whole drive. And again, frequently, it was not uncommon, I should say, for it to not happen, to not get a resupply stop at all, according to my research. What were your primary restock items? Of course, coffee, beans, bacon, flour, and ammunition. We'll get into fresh meat here in a second, but they would often want to gorge themselves on fresh meat or steak or beef when they had the possibility while in a resupply town or whatever else. If they ran low on coffee or bacon, obviously your morale on the trail is going to drop quickly. Some journals would note that a chuck-wagon crew could stretch a 100-pound coffee supply by watering it down toward the end. Now, you can do that, and I guess it's better than no coffee at all, but you are going to have some angry cowboys when they wake up or come back in and they get weak, watered-down coffee. So you better have those coffee beans. Now, water supply. Water was the biggest challenge on the trail from all my research, even more challenging than food. For the men, they would drink directly from streams, rivers, or they would sometimes dig shallow wells. The cook would keep a few barrels on the wagon, and they would fill or replenish these whenever they passed a good water source on the trail. Now, pay attention to this. For the cattle, a herd of 2,000 head could consume or require, a little bit difference there, consume and require, between 20 to 25,000 gallons of water per day. That is a lot of water. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be possible, so of course, sometimes you're going to have more, sometimes you are going to have less. This required extensive planning, trail planning. There were routes like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving trails that were chosen specifically because they had reliable water holes spaced 10 to 15 miles apart. The trail boss would often scout ahead to check them. Now remember, folks, you may have heard some background noise there. I filmed this or taped these episodes in my workshop here in the knife shop at Techline and Gear Convoy, knife shop. So, getting some background noise occasionally. It is what it is. When water was scarce, they would sometimes dig out small wells or buffalo wallows to collect rainwater, or in extreme cases, they could cut open cactus for moisture. I'm not sure how much that would serve when you're dealing with that large of group of men, and that's not going to do anything for the cattle, obviously, but that's what the research brought up. Cowboys would drink coffee even when it was half-boiled mud water. Why? Not just because of the caffeine, but it was safer than drinking straight from stagnant ponds. Folks, we don't really know what hardship is today for the most part. When you think about these guys, sometimes if you deviated from the trail or got into someplace off trail and you didn't know, you were on your own. There was no GPS, no cell phones, no sat phones. You had to deal with what you had, and I'm sure there were times when it got brutal, and many people perished on the trails. Coffee on the trail, we've discussed this, but to give you an idea, total provisions here, 2,000 to 2,500 pounds of supplies carried in the chuck wagon. Coffee, again, 100 to 125 pounds. They would oftentimes or occasionally get resupply. 1 to 2 times would be generally the maximum, according to my research. They had to plan ahead, and they had to make sure they got what they needed when they had the opportunity. And again, they could sometimes require up to 20,000 gallons per day for the herd. That's counting for the animals, not the men. So there was a lot going on. This was a very, very big operation. You had to make sure you were prepared, because if you didn't, you would find yourself out on the trail and you were in serious trouble, and there was no cavalry to call in. So that goes over the logistics. Let's jump back in and go to meals on the trail. What was chuck-wagon grub and campfire cooking really like? Allow me to get a quick sip from my throat, folks. When we watch westerns and depictions of the traditional American West are in abundance here in cinema in America, especially, and they're one of my favorite, probably possibly my favorite genre of film and movie. What we typically think of is we picture cowboys out on the open range. We see the big sky, the dust, and the herd stretching out to the horizon. But what we don't picture is the cook fire. That was the heart of every trail drive was really beating, was at that cook fire. Out there, food wasn't just fuel. It was survival, morale, and a little taste of home carried on the wind. That's what sustained you through those long, hot, dusty, dry days and those oftentimes freezing nights away from your family, friends, and your home. Since we know a cattle drive could last for months from the Texas plains to the railheads in Kansas or beyond, these men had to ride frequently up to 14 hours a day, sun up to sundown. And when they came back to camp, they were bone tired and hungry. The chuck-wagon was the kitchen, pantry, and grocery store all in one, carrying flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, dried fruit, and a few precious spices if they were fortunate. Fresh vegetables were almost unheard of after the first week, and obviously refrigeration didn't exist, so everything that made it to the trail had to keep. Cook, or again Cookie as he was often called, was one of the most important men in the outfit. He wasn't just a chef, he was a doctor, dentist, referee, and sometimes the only one with a sense of humor after a week of storms nonstop. A good cook could make or break a drive. The best ones knew how to stretch a little salt pork and a bag of beans into something that filled men's bellies and lifted their spirits. What was the backbone of the trail diet? It was beans. They were durable, cheap, and high in protein. They'd be soaked overnight and then slow cooked all day in a Dutch oven with chunks of salt pork, bacon, or beef trimmings tossed in for flavor. By supper time, it would be a delicious, thick, smoky, and rich mixture packed with the kind of flavor only a campfire can add. Some cooks would add molasses or dried chilies if they had them, but most kept it simple. Beans, salt pork, and a little bit of grease. Now about the infamous cattle drive steaks. Fresh meat was rare, but not impossible. When a steer went lame or was injured along the drive, it was butchered and eaten. That meant the beef was fresh and often cooked within hours of being cut. The cook would slice the meat thin, season it with salt, maybe a little pepper if he had it, and fry it in a cast iron skillet over an open flame. There was no marinating, sous vide, or fancy cuts. It was as straightforward as it gets. But after days of beans and biscuits, that sizzling steak was pure heaven. Now, an interesting note. A typical frequency of having steak on the trail. Remember, the cattle represented money on the hoof. That was the whole point for the cattle drive, was to get as many cattle as possible to be sold at market. So they weren't just killing these things every day to get themselves a quick steak dinner. Historians and first-hand trail diaries suggest that cowboys might have eaten fresh beef once or twice a week at most, and sometimes went weeks without it if no animals were lost. The rest of the time it was beans, salt pork, biscuits, and coffee, the unchanging staples of the cowboy diet. So while Hollywood shows them frequently eating steaks every night, reality was a lot more about beans and bacon grease with a little salt pork added. Biscuits were the other staple, cooked in cast-iron Dutch ovens, buried in hot coals. Cookie would make them from scratch using flour, lard, baking powder, and sometimes a bit of sourdough starter he kept alive and treated as though it were a pet. The smell of biscuits baking could pull a cowboy out of his bedroll faster than the sunrise. Salt pork. Let's dig into salt pork a little bit. What is salt pork? Salt pork was basically heavily salted, fatty pork belly. Very similar to today's unsmoked, uncured bacon, but preserved to last far longer. It came in barrels packed tightly in coarse salt or brine. Each piece was thick, fatty, and not smoked like traditional bacon of today. A typical 200-pound barrel might hold 50 to 60 slabs of pork belly submerged in brine. Unlike smoked bacon, salt pork wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. The intense salting process pulled moisture from the meat, killing bacteria and keeping it edible for months, even in warm weather. How was it preserved? The preservation process was something like this. First, butchering, obviously, fresh pork bellies or side meat were cut into large slabs. They went through a dry salt cure. Each slab was rubbed down with coarse salt, sometimes mixed with brown sugar or saltpeter, potassium nitrate, to slow spoilage. Brining. The meat was packed in wooden barrels with layers of salt, then covered with a strong brine made from salt and water. Finally, storage. The barrels were sealed and stored in a cool cellar or wagon, the salt keeping bacteria and insects at bay. If kept sealed, salt pork could last 6 months to a year, even through summer drives. However, once opened, it had to be eaten within a few weeks. How did the cowboys prepare salt pork? It was too salty to eat without soaking or boiling first. Typically, they would cut off a slab with a knife, soak it in water, frequently overnight, to draw out the excess salt, and then boil or fry it in a skillet or Dutch oven. Then they would serve it alongside beans, biscuits, or potatoes. Some cooks would slice it thin and fry it to a crisp like bacon, while others chopped it into small cubes and added it to beans or stews for flavor, which was frequently the way it was employed, according to my research. The fat from the salt pork also served as a cooking grease, since fresh oil or butter wasn't available on the trail. It could also be used as grease, a flavor base, or a preservation aid for other foods. It could be poured over cooked meat or biscuits to seal out air. So that is the story of how salt pork was made and used. But how did it actually taste? I had the opportunity to taste salt pork a couple of years ago. I'm going to tell you right now, it's been a while. This was probably over a decade ago, easily over a decade ago. My recollection was extremely salty and bland. It did not taste like something I would want to eat frequently or regularly. So that was my take. Let's go with what the research says here. How salt pork actually tasted. It was incredibly salty, fatty, and plain, far from the smoky, savory bacon we're used to today. Most accounts describe it with an overpowering saltiness. Even after soaking and boiling, it was still very salty. One cowboy memoir described it as chewing a greasy lump of ocean. The meat was about 2/3 fat, so it left a heavy, slick coating in your mouth of grease. However, the grease was at least precious and useful on the trail for energy and cooking. It had a mild pork flavor. If you boiled or fried it enough, the pure pork flavor came through. Soft, simple, and fatty. When fried crisp, it was tolerable or even tasty. When undercooked or unsoaked, it was nearly inedible. There was no smoke, no spice. No smoke curing, no pepper, no flavoring, just salt. A cowboy might sprinkle sugar on it if he had some, but that was exceedingly rare. When fried crispy, sliced thin and fried until brown, it tasted similar to unsmoked bacon, salty, chewy, and rich. Where it shined was when cooked in beans, the salt and fat soaked into the beans, giving them a savory flavor that cowboys look forward to. Boiled and diced. When mixed into biscuits or stews, it provided body and flavor that plain flour or beans couldn't. The taste improved dramatically when blended into other foods, which is why beans and salt pork became the signature cowboy meal. How did cowboys describe it? A few brief anecdotes. Greasy as axle oil, but better than starving. If you boiled it twice and prayed hard, you could eat it without puckering. The cook soaked it all night and fried it at dawn. Tasted like heaven next to that bitter coffee. So folks, you take that information and do with it what you want. We're going to jump back in to our menu. What about dessert? If they were lucky, there might be some dried apples or peaches rehydrated into a cobbler, cooked under a crust of biscuit dough. For breakfast, there was usually salt pork, leftover beans, maybe some flapjacks if you were fortunate and supplies allowed, all washed down again with the ubiquitous strong, bitter coffee that started and ended every day on the plains. It wasn't gourmet cuisine, but it did the job. The food was heavy, simple, and meant to last. After riding through wind, rain, and dust, nobody really cared about presentation or how it was plated when presented. It was hot, hearty, and real. Out there on the open trail, when the stars came out and the firelight hit the tin plates just right, that meal, beans, biscuits, salt pork, or maybe a piece of beef, felt like a feast fit for kings. All right, folks. Now, typically, we would go ahead and end off the show, the MOA broadcast, with a nice rowdy or raucous story of somebody going wild in a Whataburger or an In-N-Out burger or shooting up a cruise line or whatever it is in Florida. But today we're going to go ahead and finish this with a brief story about an actual cowboy. Again, sometimes stories and research will conflict, but this is our story and we're going with it. Today, and as a brief note, this is something we're going to dig into later. For those of you that may not know it, post-Civil War, about 25 to 30% of cowboys were black. Now, this doesn't line up with what we see oftentimes in movies and pop culture, but it was a reality, and some of the absolute best cowboys were black. We're going to dig into that in a future episode and go into a deep dive story on that, because there's a lot of fascinating history that just doesn't get played out and recounted frequently enough. And that also is the foundation of our cowboy story today, the ride of Bose Ikard. Here's a story that used to be told in every cow camp from Texas to Montana about a man named Bose Ikard, a name that deserves to be remembered right alongside the likes of Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. Ikard was born enslaved in Mississippi in the 1840s, but by the end of his life he'd become one of the best-known trail drivers in the West, trusted by Goodnight himself, who once said, "I never had a better man." Now, for those of you who don't know, let me interject briefly. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving were the two men that were the inspiration for the two main characters of Woodrow McCall in Lonesome Dove. And I can't think for Augustus McGray and Woodrow McCall in Lonesome Dove. So another fascinating side story we're going to jump into in the future. But back to Bose Ikard. When the Civil War ended, Ikard headed west and signed on with Goodnight and Loving as a drover. This was in the era when Texas was bursting with longhorns, wild, bony cattle left over from the Spanish herds. There were millions of them roaming free, but hardly worth a dime unless you could get them north to the railheads. And that's where Ikard came in. He rode at the heart of the drives, driving cattle from Texas all the way to the markets in Colorado and Kansas. It wasn't the kind of work that made a man rich, but it was the kind that made him remembered. One summer, sometime in the late 1860s, Ikard was riding with Goodnight's crew north along the old Goodnight-Loving Trail, cutting through rough country in what's now West Texas. They had about 2,000 head of longhorns, half wild and nervous as a room full of rattlesnakes. The country was dry, and every creek bed was dust. They were hoping to make the next watering hole by nightfall. As the sun dipped low, the herd caught scent of wolves, or maybe Comanches in the wind, but something spooked them. The 2,000 longhorns turned into a rolling wave of dust and thunder. Men shouted, whips cracked, and horses plunged into the stampede. It was the nightmare that every drover dreaded. But Bose Ikard didn't think. He just acted. He spurred his horse toward the head of the herd, cutting across the front in a gamble that could have killed him and his horse. The moon was just rising, and in that silvery light he rode low and hard, yelling, firing his pistol into the air, trying to swing the leaders back into his circle before they trampled the remuda and the camp. Goodnight later said that Ikard's cool head and fast horse saved the whole outfit that night. By dawn, the cattle were settled again, the air thick with dust and the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. The men gathered around the chuck-wagon for coffee, and Goodnight rode over to Ikard. He didn't say much, just nodded and said, "Bose, I reckon you saved us all." That kind of respect meant something out there. On the trail, it wasn't where you came from that counted. It was whether you could do the job when the chips were down. Ikard stayed with Goodnight for years, handling the money, keeping records, and helping blaze the trail that would carry tens of thousands of cattle north. When he finally retired near Weatherford, Texas, Goodnight gave him land, and the two remained close friends until Ikard's death in 1929. Goodnight himself had a granite headstone carved for Bose's grave. It reads, "Served with me for 4 years on the Goodnight-Loving Trail. Never shirked a duty or told a falsehood. A faithful worker and a brave man." That's as fine an epitaph as a cowboy ever earned or could hope for. Today, historians talk about the cattle drives in terms of the big names, the trailblazers, the ranchers, the railroad men, and the cattle barons. But the truth is, the West was built on the backs of men like Bose Ikard, who rode hard, worked honest, and never asked for much beyond a horse, a meal, and a place to bed down under the stars. So the next time you pour a cup of camp coffee, think about that man riding into the teeth of a stampede with nothing but his 6-gun, a good horse, and grit enough to turn 2,000 half-mad longhorns back into line. Because that is what the Old West was made of. All right, folks, that's going to do it for today's episode of the MOA broadcast. Remember, folks, don't wait until you have an emergency to prepare. If you wait, it may be too late. If you don't make it out alive, you don't make it out at all. Stay safe out there, folks.